Hey guys, welcome back. It is Teasdale here, and today we are going through Phyrexia all with one, I think it's called, the new set. It feels quite refreshing at the moment because I feel like we haven't been getting a set every minute, so it's not too bad, but I've gone through all of the spoilers and I've come up with, I've kind of cheated a bit, but my top 5, including some honourable mentions in what I think are the most impactful cards in Phyrexia all with one for Pauper. So first of all, let's dive right in to my honourable mentions. Number 5, John, honourable mentions is Dross Skull Bomb. So I don't think these Skull Bombs are very playable. I don't think any of them. The other 4 are definitely very, very, very bad, I would say. Because most of the time a Spell Bomb is just better than most of them. Blue one's probably a bit on the maybe. But this one is close. You're going to get to playable, I would say. It is currently competing for the Blood Fountain slot. Is where I'd probably put this. Or something along that. If you're considering playing Blood Fountain, you probably considered playing this. And I do think this loses out pretty much all the time. But, that being said, you never know. Something might happen to Blood Fountain. They could decide that's the broken card in Affinity. Who knows? But this card is definitely, probably worth considering for that slot. And that's one of my honorable mentions. Next one is Blazing Crescendo. This is more for like Blitz and maybe Prowess decks. Basically, just to look at pushing that 3 extra damage and getting to like do half a Reckless Impulse seems pretty good to me. Best way I can say this is Lightning Strike plus draw a card isn't the worst. So, that's kind of how I'm seeing this card. Don't get me wrong, obviously, much worse with removal, but hey ho. Definitely an honourable mention in those sort of decks. Ain't going to be breaking any metas anytime soon, however. This one, Plague Nurse, is an interesting one that I don't actually think is on a lot of people's lists, but it's probably just because I'm bad at evaluating cards and you shouldn't listen to what I say. But I really like this card. And I don't like it for the reasons that probably people think I like it for. But basically, I see this as sort of, I want to say fighting for a Packmate slot in a mid-range green deck. Maybe not Ponza, because that's kind of a different beast, but something along them lines, maybe like Jund Wildfire or something along them lines, where all you're trying to do is just play mid-range creatures and attrition them out. This card is above rate. It's a 3/4 for 4, which is pretty nice. Void's Bolt, all that sort of stuff. But then, if you get into attrition-based game, this card can single-handedly just win the game. You can just play this guy, and then he attacks for 3, 2 poison. You can make it 3 poison. It can hit. It puts your opponent on a 4-turn clock just off the Toxic, and that's with only one of them. I don't think it's probably not going to break any metas or see any real play, but that's kind of where I see this card. It might not be the best, but it's definitely a consideration for that slot, which is why I do kind of like it. But moving on to the last and final honourable mention is Malkator's Watcher, which is, I see this card as almost, it's good at blocking flyers, and it's really good with Deadly Dispute / Bargain, and its artifact. So that automatically means it's definitely a consideration. And it also has Vigilance, so it can attack and block, which is also pretty nice. Again, I don't think it's going to break any metas, but I do think this is definitely a consideration, potentially even for Affinity. But again, I could be wrong. Don't trust my opinion. Anyways, moving on finally to number 5 in my top 5 list. I think that this card may be really good in Pauper because there are a lot of Affinity decks and a lot of different variations where people have tried Glaze Fiend, they've tried cutting the blue, they've tried cutting the red, all that sort of stuff. Well, this card might actually give consideration to running white. So you can now effectively have 2 Glaze Fiend plus effects, and it's got Lifelink, which is not an irrelevant ability in a meta full of Kuldotha. It might not be good, it might not be insane, and it's definitely close to just an honourable mention, but I do think this means you may actually consider not running one of the colours, or basically just running a completely different build of Affinity, you still get to run your Deadly Dispute package, you get to run your Spheres, you get to run Frogmites, Enforcers, Blood Fountains, but you can just run this as well. You could potentially run it without the blue and still run the red, and you still get Makeshift Munitions and Galv Blast, but you lose Kenku and Thoughtcast and the counterspell. You may decide to run this as red, black, white. No, blue, red, white. Seems bad, but you lose Deadly Dispute. You lose Reckoner's Bargain, but you gain Court Courier, I believe it might be called. The 1 white and a blue, they look at the top 2 cards. These are all cards that you can definitely consider that you, if you mill over an artifact, you gain life, all this sort of stuff. You've definitely a lot of options, especially since Modern Horizons 2, for artifacts and all sorts of different colours. So this might make this even more of a consideration to basically run white. And that's why I think it's number 5 on my list. Moving on to number 4, I think Anoint with Affliction is secretly really good, even not in a corrupted deck or a poison deck. I think the fact that it exiles a creature that has mana value 3 or less at instant speed is very valuable. Exile can be quite good against Affinity. It hits Kenku, it hits the land it animates, it also hits Swift Spear, it hits Dwarf, it hits obviously all these sort of things. It also hits the Raven Inspector, and that card is busted. What more can you say? This card is insane. But not really. In all seriousness, it is actually just probably a solid removal spell. That's another consideration, depending on your meta, and depending on how big these things are. Yes, it doesn't hit Enforcer, it doesn't hit Gurmag Angler, it doesn't hit Terror, but if you are playing a poison counter deck, then yes, then this obviously gets insanely much better for that. Moving on to number 3. This one is more just a cycle, and my number 3 is the Sphere lands. These are almost like cycle lands, which I do think are, obviously there's pros and cons to both, but I do think a lot of the time, in pop, because we are a lot slower, unless you are obviously like Tron with your Remote Isle, or a much more aggressive deck maybe, I think Sphere lands basically win out. You can potentially see these in farms, in maybe Mono Black Gardens, or Mono Black Control, or Devotion, or whatever you want to call it. Also, you can kind of probably look at running these a lot easier than, say, the new Capenna lands, wherever they saw play, which is pretty nice. So that is why I think this is probably number 3 on my list. The next one, for my number 2, is kind of cheating. Probably, well, actually, it's really cheating because it's like 7 cards. But it is basically the blue-black proliferate cards in one. And that is the Quench, that basically becomes a hard counter spell. The draw a card, you gain a poison counter. The Impulse that proliferates. There is a Divination. I can't remember the name of the black spell, draw 2, lose 2, but your opponent gets a poison counter. There is target creature gets -1/-1 and proliferate. And there is Vraska's Fall, which is an edict that you get a poison counter. So, all in all, I think each opponent gets a poison counter, draw a card, can be a consideration on its own as a card in, say, Familiars or in Jeskai Wildfire or something along those lines. It's just a really bad draw spell that means you can run this as a one-off, and it can just realistically give you an out to win the game. Your opponent's Stonehorn Dignitary in you, your opponent's gained 1,000 life with Weatherstorm, God knows what they're doing, well-wishing you to death. You could basically just Ephemerate loop this, and obviously Ephemerate, and just give your opponent 10 poison counters and you win the game. That is probably the worst, and definitely the flaw for this card, but there is an old school deck that used to knock around, not very good, basically using counters off depletion lands, off certain other effects that basically were positive, but you can only use them for so often, and it basically decided to proliferate those. So with that, you can use Vraska's Fall and the prologue to, I'm not even going to pretend to say that name, and get them a poison counter, and this can basically use that to then just while you're casting your spells, you're casting your You're casting your quenches, you're casting your impulses, you're casting your edict effects, you're casting your random kill spells. You're just proliferating these poison counters. You're triggering the corrupted, which then can also take place with your anoint the affliction, all that sort of stuff. And you can kind of just be like maybe a proliferate based teachings deck, and you're just kind of killing the board, gaining card advantage, and just proliferating this poison counter and killing your opponent that way. I think that's probably, it might be a deck, it could be a consideration. It all depends on how the metagame goes and how it shapes up, but I believe that could potentially definitely be an option. So it's kind of cheating that it is just one card, because I do think it as a whole is probably where I think it'll see play. If it sees play or not is another question entirely, but I do think it's probably worth testing. So you'll definitely be catching me playing this once it's on Magic Online, 100%. Finally, my number one pick for the best card in one is Planar Disruption. Now this card, don't get me wrong, it's a pacifism. As good as a pacifism can be, this hits artifacts. This also hits indestructible lands. So it can be a Stone Rain at worst, but it can also just hit Tolarian Terror, and it's kind of done with. That's it. It kind of also stops it being like Crawl from the Cellar, or it stops it being, you know, you can definitely answer it from being Fanged or whatever, which is quite nice, and it just kind of sits there. So that is okay. But it is just a pacifism, so there is obviously limitations to this. But I do think it is definitely a consideration, as it can hit bridges. This makes it a lot better, and also activate ability is also very good. You can, it's effectively Journey to Nowhere 5/8. It could make mono blue or a deck that struggles with removal have access to a lot more removal. So that's kind of my thought process on this card. I do think it's pretty strong, and it's why it's my number one pick for Phyrexia All With One. I'll get this name right eventually. But guys, that is it for this video. I hope you guys like this video, and if you do like to see these this type of content when new sets come out, please let me know and hit me up with a like and subscribe and a comment down below, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.